Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Well, yeah. Thank you very much, Andrea, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming and being here today. So what I'm going to do today is to, in this presentation, I'm going to report results of a study that I conducted with my colleague Stuart Webb from Western University in Canada, where we explored the role of lexical coverage in reading. So as we all know, reading is a key component of second language proficiency, and it's crucial to achieve and to develop literacy in a second language. So one of the main concerns of reading researchers has been then to look for and examine what are the predictors of reading comprehension. And numerous studies have shown that there are many different factors that predict reading comprehension, including syntactic skills, decoding skills, working memory, and the ability to build a mental model of the text. And among all these factors, one that has received a lot of attention from researchers is the role of vocabulary knowledge. So many studies have explored this relationship, and they've shown a strong positive correlation between vocabulary knowledge, both breadth and depth, and reading comprehension. And within this, so as I was saying, many vocabulary researchers and reading researchers have looked at this relationship, and within this relation between reading and vocabulary, one that has also received a lot of attention from researchers is this idea of lexical coverage, which is what I'm going to focus on today and what we explored in this study. So lexical coverage is defined as the percentage of known words in a text. And although we, of course, know that there are many different factors affecting predicting reading comprehension, lexical coverage has been considered one of the most influential, most important factors affecting comprehension. So when we think about lexical coverage, I think we can identify two kind of lines of research and two main strands. So some studies have looked at the percentage of known words in a given text that it's important and that it's necessary, they're necessary to know in order to achieve adequate comprehension. And the other line of research, or the other strand, is to explore the vocabulary size needed in order to attain and obtain that coverage. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on this first line of research. So the percentage of known words in a text that are important to achieve adequate comprehension. So this is what we know so far in the context of reading, as we have a few studies that have explored this relationship. In the LSLARF study in 1989, she found that and concluded that 95% coverage was needed for reasonable comprehension of a general academic text. So learners needed to know basically 95% of the words in a text in order to achieve reasonable comprehension. The figures, as you can see in the different studies, have really ranged from 95 to 98. In the study by Hyeonjeong in 2000, they suggested that it was actually 98% coverage that was required for what they call adequate comprehension of a fiction text. In the study by Schmidt, Yang, and Grebe in 2011, they didn't really specify a particular threshold, but they found a linear relationship between lexical coverage and comprehension, but they concluded that 98% was really necessary if we wanted learners to achieve scores in the comprehension test higher than 60%. And finally, in the study by LSLARF and Ravenhorst-Kalowski in 2010, they found and they suggested that maybe we could identify two percentages. So maybe 95 was required for minimal comprehension, and then 98 if we really wanted to achieve optimal comprehension. And these figures were also confirmed for the context of listening in the Van Zielen and Schmidt study. So overall, we see figures ranging from 95 to 98. In general, a high percentage of words in a text need to be known to achieve adequate comprehension. And from these studies, researchers tend to suggest that it's probably the higher, the 98% figure, if we're really talking about adequate comprehension of the different ideas and details in a text. So this is really what we know about lexical coverage figures and the evidence that is out there. And these figures are really important because they've been used to justify the selection of reading materials. And this is not just in research, but also in teaching. So we very often calculate the coverage of a particular text, and we say, oh, yeah, there was a 98% or 97% coverage, so students should be fine with this text, and they should understand and have no comprehension difficulties. And also these figures are really important because they are being used to set important vocabulary learning targets in teaching. But it's important that we remember, as Webb recently argued, that with these few studies that we have and the few variables that may affect comprehension having been examined, really, the discussions of how generalizable these figures are likely to be overstated. So we certainly need, this is, I believe, an area within vocabulary research where we need more studies. And what I found really interesting is that these coverage figures are also used to make assumptions about not comprehension, but also, for example, learning. So in vocabulary learning studies, we often report coverage figures and say, well, the text had a 98% coverage, so learners should be fine, and therefore they should be able to learn incidentally from context, but we really don't have empirical evidence to show that that's indeed the case. And we also make assumptions that because the lexical coverage was 98 or 97.5, then the actual reading of the text should be easy, and it shouldn't really like learners shouldn't really make any effort in reading the text. But again, this is not something that we have really evidence for. So, the studies that I showed were really looking at lexical coverage for comprehension. There are a couple of studies that have tried to look beyond comprehension. So we have the study by Liu and Nation in 1985. They looked at the ability to infer from context, and they found that probably around 96% was necessary for successful guessing of the words from context. And more recently, Laufer identified that both 95 and 98% coverage were better and led to significantly higher scores than the 90% condition for inferencing. And what she's suggesting, and that was really interesting, that the lexical threshold should probably consist of a combination of sight vocabulary, so the words that learners and readers know, even out of context, and inferred vocabulary, the vocabulary that they can actually infer from context. But again, this is everything that we have, to my knowledge, on lexical coverage. We don't have studies looking at lexical coverage and vocabulary learning, or the effect of lexical coverage and cognitive effort and online processing of texts. So this is what we try to do in this study, is start to really explore some of these aspects, really trying to provide a more comprehensive understanding of the role of lexical coverage. So we wanted to investigate the effect that different percentages of lexical coverage had on comprehension, but also the ability to learn incidentally from the text, the ability to infer the meaning of words from context, also participants' perceived difficulty, how they felt, how difficult they perceived the text to be, and also their online processing efforts, so how the text was actually read. So this is what we did in this study. The participants were 94 advanced speakers of English, postgraduate students. In the UK, they were from a range of L1 backgrounds, and they had around 6,000 to 7,000 words for vocabulary size. They were asked to read a story from the Hue and Nation study. So we used the materials from that study. The Escaped Madman was the name of the story. It was a short narrative, and there were 4 different versions. And the way, so one for each of the lexical coverage percentages. So we had a 90% version, 95, 98, and 100. So the way these conditions were designed were by replacing low frequency words with pseudo words. So that way we could be sure that they would know all the words in the story except for the target items. So we could manipulate the lexical coverage percentages. So in the 90% version, there were 10% of pseudo words, 5% in the 95% condition, 2% in the 98, and in the control 100% condition, they were all high frequency words that everybody would be familiar with. The pseudo words were also from the Huon Nation study. All target words that we included in the analysis appeared 1 to 2 times. There were a few words, but very few, 6 words, pseudo words that were deleted because they appeared significantly higher number of times. So one word appeared 5 times and another one 4 times. So we deleted them and just included those that appear 1 to 2 times and were consistent across the conditions. And as I was saying, all remaining words from the text were from the 3,000 most frequent words in English. And we assume that since these were advanced learners of English, they would be very familiar with these words. So measurement instruments. So for the offline measures, the tests that they completed, so we asked them to complete a comprehension test. This was also the same test used by Huon Nation. It was a 14-item multiple choice test. Then we also asked them we present them with the list of pseudo words in their condition and ask them to recall the meaning with a definition, translation, synonym, whatever they wanted. The inferencing test was also a recall test. So at the end, we gave them the text again and asked them to guess the meaning of those pseudo words from context. And we also asked them to rate the text difficulty in a scale from 1 to 10. As for the online measures, we use recordings of their eye movements. So we used iLink 1000+ to measure and record their eye movements while they read the text. So that gives us information about how fast the test was read, number of fixations, so the number of times they stop in different words, and the length of the fixation, so the duration of those fixations, for how long they were fixating on different parts in the text, and also the saccades, the movements from different points in the text. And this gives us an opportunity to see whether, and this is what we were assuming, that the more words learners and readers knew in a text, the faster and more fluent the reading of that text. That was the assumption, but we'll see what we found. So we looked at 3, as you will see, 3 measures of text reading: average fixation duration, the number of fixations, and number of saccades. So as the procedure, typical procedure in a reading study, they read a text, then afterwards they completed the vocabulary recall test, comprehension test, difficulty rating, and then finally the inferencing. Participants were randomly assigned to one of the conditions, and there were no significant differences in vocabulary size among the 4 groups. So they had a similar level of vocabulary knowledge. The analysis, we had a range of dependent variables, and then the independent variable was lexical coverage with 4 levels for comprehension and eye movements, because we included the 100 version, and 3 levels for vocabulary learning, inferencing, and text difficulty. And we used, depending on the normal distribution of the data, we analyzed the role of the independent variable on the dependent variable with either Kruskal-Wallis test on one-way ANOVAs. So let's see what we found. Starting with comprehension, so we have the 4 conditions there and the mean scores, and as expected, as we see an increase in comprehension with the increase in lexical coverage, and that's what we expect. So far so good, but what we found, and there was a significant difference across the groups, but post-hoc tests showed that the difference was really between the 100 condition and the 90 and 95, but there were no differences across 98, 95, and 90. So another way to look at the effect of comprehension, and this is what previous studies have done, and we wanted to basically do the same, is to look at the number of learners that actually reached a particular comprehension, and they got a particular percentage of comprehension in the comprehension test. So we look at that. These are the loads of percentages. So we have the percentages in terms of lexical coverage, the conditions, 90, 95, 98, and 100. And then we have the comprehension thresholds. So these are different thresholds that have been examined in the literature. 55%, 70, and 85. So if we look at 55%, the first row, pretty much all the learners, over 85% of the learners actually got that comprehension in all conditions. In the 70% condition, we see that more than 80% of the learners actually got that comprehension from 95 onwards, but not so much in the 90% condition. So that was more difficult if we aim for a 70 percentage scores in the comprehension test. And finally, and this is what the study by Hyeonjeong, and following them, what we did was to focus on this 85% comprehension, which has been considered necessary for adequate comprehension, comprehension. What we found here that it's really in the first two conditions, 90 and 95. So when people only know 90% or 95% of the words in the text, really not many people actually got that level of comprehension. So it was really from the 98% condition that we get more than half of the participants getting that level of comprehension. So if we are aiming for that 85% comprehension, so that level of optimum comprehension, as previous studies have suggested, we're really looking at 98% of lexical coverage onwards. In terms of incidental learning, we were really not expecting many gains, obviously, because these words, these pseudo words, were presented only once or twice. This was a very short text, very short reading activity, but we still wanted to see whether there would be differences across conditions. And we found very similar, very low scores, and very similar across conditions, a bit higher in the 95%, but the results of the Kruskal-Wallis test showed that it wasn't statistically, so there were no differences across conditions at all in terms of vocabulary knowledge, all the same. In terms of lexical inferencing, also as we expect, we see clearly an increase in the number of words that people could infer from context, with an increase in lexical coverage. So the more words you know in a text, the better your ability to infer the meaning of the remaining words from context, which makes sense. But again, we see that, so there was a significant difference, but the difference was between the 90 and the 98% condition. So learners in the 98% condition were able to infer more words than those in the 90% condition, which makes sense. So there seems to be an advantage of the 98% coverage in terms of lexical, the ability to infer the meaning from context. So these scores of the vocabulary learning and also the lexical inferencing analysis were including, of course, we looked at percentages because by design there were a different number of words in each condition. So we were thinking that these patterns could also be due to the fact that the pseudo words were different across conditions. So we ran the analysis again, looking at the 11 common items, so the common pseudo words that appear across conditions. And overall, while the descriptive statistics are really similar, so in vocabulary learning, we see pretty much very similar scores, a little bit higher in the 95% condition, but very similar. For lexical inferencing, we see the same, higher scores with increased lexical coverage, but the results of the analysis show that there were no significant differences across conditions. So when we look at the common items across conditions, that significant difference that we saw for lexical inferencing kind of disappears. So in terms of vocabulary learning and lexical inferencing, really, there were no differences across the different conditions. And looking at the online measures, so how people read the text, as I was saying at the beginning, we were expecting more fluent, faster processing of the text. with increased exposure, with increased lexical coverage. And this is kind of what we found if we look at the mean scores for average fixation duration, we see that they are, so the duration of fixations is faster with increased lexical coverage. So if you know more words, so obviously in the 100% condition where learners knew all the words, the reading was faster. But these differences, surprisingly, and this is not what we expected, were not significant. We didn't find any significant differences across in any of the measures that we looked at. So this actually suggests that the actual reading of the text was very similar in the three conditions, 90, 95, or 98. In terms of perceived difficulty, we did see a significant difference. Again, as we expected, people rated, so the text was rated as easier to read with increased lexical coverage. So the more words learners knew in a text, the easier the text was perceived to be, even though it wasn't really reflected in the actual reading of the text. There was a difference in the perception of difficulty. And we found, so there was again a significant difference between the 98% condition, which was rated as significantly easier than the 90%. So to conclude, what have we seen in this study, in this preliminary analysis? In terms of comprehension, we did find a significant effect of comprehension, but if you remember, it was really between the 100% condition and the 90 and 95. So there were no differences between 90, 95 and 98 conditions. When we look at the level of adequate or optimum comprehension, we did see that the majority of participants reached that level of comprehension in the 98% condition. So that is really in line with what we've seen in previous studies, that if we are aiming for that level of comprehension, of optimum comprehension, we're really looking at a 98% coverage figure. In vocabulary learning, no significant effect of lexical coverage on vocabulary learning. So they seem to learn in a similar way, regardless of the amount of words that they don't know in the text. Lexical inferencing, we saw initially a significant effect with the 98% coverage condition leading to higher gains than the 90%. But then when we look at the common items, this effect actually disappeared. So the patterns on that initial significant effect might actually be due to differences in the items and not so much about due to the percentage of lexical coverage. With perceived difficulty, we did find a significant effect, and the 98% condition was rated as significantly easier, which also makes sense. In terms of online processing, this is not what we expected, but when we've looked at these three measures of overall text reading, actually there was no significant effect. And so it means that a lower percentage of lexical coverage doesn't really lead to increased cognitive effort, at least in the analysis that we've completed. So overall, what we've seen when we try to actually look at lexical coverage across a variety of measures is that the lexical coverage percentages really seem to have a different effect on comprehension, learners' ability to learn from the text, their ability to infer from context, their perceptions of difficulty, and how they actually process and read the text. So I think this at least clearly shows that before we use what we know about lexical coverage figures to make assumptions and claims about how the text is read and how people will be able to learn or infer from context, we have to be careful, and we really need more research before we can make assumptions and claims and valid claims about these issues. So of course, there's some limitations that point us in to important future directions. In terms of vocabulary learning, we know we use a very challenging test. A meaning recall test is very challenging, and it would be good in future studies to also use meaning recognition, which tends to be easier and tap into kind of earlier levels of vocabulary learning. We also need to look at all the components of lexical mastery. So it would be nice to include a battery of vocabulary tests to further look into vocabulary knowledge from reading. We need to explore the interaction between lexical coverage with other lexical and textual features. And I think this is something that is coming clear from this study, that there is a range of factors that would affect that, not only lexical coverage. So we really need to look at the interaction among all those different factors. In terms of online processing, we haven't seen any differences in this analysis. So it might be the case that for us to see increased cognitive effort when reading a text, we need to look at lower coverages. So we chose the ones that have been explored in terms of comprehension, but it will be interesting to look at 70% or 80%. So when learners and when readers know, way fewer words in a text, maybe that's where we see the effect. So this is something that we should really explore. Exploring the processing of the actual pseudo words, the unknown vocabulary. This is what we are working on at the moment. So the measures in terms of eye movements, the measures that I presented today are just 3 global measures of text reading, but we are now looking at the actual reading of the pseudo words, and we expect to see probably a difference there. Because if there are more words that are unknown in a text, the resources that you have left to actually focus on the unknown vocabulary might be fewer. So we'll see, but that's what we're working on at the moment. Also examine a wider range of measures in terms of online processing. Doing studies where we can actually control for the text and the contextual cues would be really important, because of course, inferencing ability and learning would depend on that. And we know that that's an important factor, but this is something we couldn't manipulate because we were using the original text from Hue and Nation, but it would be quite interesting to do in the future. And very important, looking at readers of different proficiencies. I mean, as we've seen from the beginning, we really have 4 or 5 studies that have looked at these. And each of these studies have looked at different types of texts, narratives, academic text, different proficiencies. So really, if we want, and it's important that we have a good idea of the effect of this factor. And I think, looking at running the same studies, but with different groups of proficiency will be very important, because some of the differences that we observe across the studies will be due to those differences in the proficiencies of participants. And I think that's everything I wanted to say. Yes, thank you very much for listening. And yeah.